If you haven't already, I highly recommend you watch my Final Fantasy VI analysis before you watch this video. In the year 2000, Squaresoft released Final Fantasy IX for the PlayStation system. I was 15 years old, and despite developing more sophisticated critical thinking skills, I was entering the lamest phase of rebellion any teenager experienced. I was rebelling not against my parents, but Squaresoft. After the perceived betrayal of Final Fantasy VIII, I was not so prepared to accept Square's cartoonish fantasy world with random Dragon Ball Z villains shooting fireballs. In other words, unlike the 16-bit predecessor, I have no nostalgia rooted in playing Final Fantasy IX during my more formative years. Now, I did return to the game as an adult, and I did enjoy it a lot more than I had as a teenager. However, as the years have gone on, I found more and more people that favor 9 above all other entries in the series. Even Hironobu Sakaguchi, the father of Final Fantasy, has often cited 9 as the game he is most proud of. So what is it about Final Fantasy IX that other players find so special? What is it that I'm not seeing? Or perhaps, what is it preventing me from enjoying the game as much as others? As usual, I hope to figure this out by first exploring the game's mechanics, and then analyzing and dissecting the game's characters, narrative, and its themes. Spoilers from here on out. There's not too much to say about dungeon design that I haven't already said for Final Fantasy VI. Almost every location tries to throw in a gimmick that engages the player far more deeply than simply wandering down lengthy corridors. Early on is an ice cavern filled with frozen walls that Vivi can melt, including secret passages to various treasures. Sometime later, the player will be asked to flick a bunch of switches in order to guide the subterranean gargants towards hidden goodies or the tunnels leading outside. The player must find the correct path through an enchanted wood, or open passageways that reveal more passageways that reveal more passageways. There certainly is variety to be had throughout the game. However, Final Fantasy IX also does not waste the player's time in any one dungeon. None of these locations overstay their welcome, averaging a half hour to an hour each. I also believe the random encounter rate has been decreased from what it had been during the Super Nintendo era. So despite the greater size and therefore longer traversal of 3D environments over 2D, the amount of encounters the player must fight through remains roughly the same. This keeps Final Fantasy IX moving at a similarly brisk pace as its 16-bit predecessor, rather than transitioning into a slog. Combat is where the game has perhaps changed the most subtle, but interesting ways. Whereas Final Fantasy VI constantly pit the player against a group of enemies, focusing on whittling your opponent's numbers down as swiftly as possible, Final Fantasy IX instead focuses on fewer groups of foes. In fact, the further into the game you progress, the more likely you are to run into just one single, monstrous beast instead of a whole multitude of elite enemies. Though the enemy may be fewer in number, they are certainly no slouch in the power department. Rather than dealing as much damage as swiftly as possible, Final Fantasy IX wants the player to fight with careful consideration. Take, for example, the Sand Golem, a standard enemy whose core is your true target. Any strike to the core results in a powerful counterattack. Should the player destroy the sand body, however, they can unleash their full power on the sand core without fear of reprisal. Even though the sand body will regenerate, it's helpful to target first in order to reduce the overall difficulty of the fight. Soul Cage is a boss that forces the player to think beyond elemental vulnerabilities. Casting fire upon the plant-based opponent ignites his leaves and limbs. This seems like a good thing until he blasts your party with a powerful blaze made possible by said spell. The only way to prevent him from causing such havoc to your team is to extinguish the flames with an ice spell, and further avoid hitting the Soul Cage with his elemental vulnerability. Have Garnet cast Float in order to evade the Hill Giant's Quake attack. Use Soft on the Stone Golem to kill it instantly. Attack Grimlock with spells or melee based on which color sphere is on top. Wait until the Epitaph finishes cloning your party member 3 times before reviving your friend. Destroy Kraken's tentacles so he can't counterattack your blows to his main body. Throughout the entirety of the game, be it boss or standard foe, Final Fantasy IX is asking the player to rely on more than raw strength. Of course, nothing works more in the player's favor than debuff spells actually serving a purpose. The Final Fantasy franchise has had a bad habit of making bosses invulnerable to most debuffs, a trait carried over quite aggressively to franchise spin-off and celebration World of Final Fantasy. This is not the case in Final Fantasy IX, with many powerful bosses being vulnerable to spells like Slow and Blind. By thinking beyond raw damage dealt, the player can actually decrease damage suffered. This reduction in enemy numbers and focus away from raw strength is all for a thematic purpose, but it's also not the only way in which Final Fantasy IX is mechanically emphasizing the value of a team's members. Perhaps one of the greatest evolutions since Final Fantasy VI is in how each character class and abilities are handled. Final Fantasy VI had started an unfortunate trend in character classes essentially being pointless, with every character being a somewhat capable spell-slinging warrior. Final Fantasy IX corrects this, giving each character their own unique set of combat skills and abilities. Much like how Magicite will gradually teach magic spells to the character it is equipped to, each piece of gear has a chance of teaching its respective character new abilities. There are also shared abilities, such as immunities to select status ailments, but each character also has a unique set of skills, attacks, and an ability boost unique to them. So, the Thief Zidane, for example, can learn Flee, a nearly guaranteed escape from any battle, or Bandit, increasing the odds of Steel's success. Even those that share character classes, such as Eiko and Garnet, are given their own unique set of abilities or spell priorities. It's far easier to find some of the more powerful white magic spells with Eiko's gear than it is for Garnet, but Garnet has a greater variety of powerful summons. By the end of the game, it's not unreasonable to have both characters in your party, each serving separate combat roles. This level of differentiation, even when it is subtle, means each character can serve a unique purpose in combat. Just like Steiner, Amarant has great offensive capabilities. However, he is also a valuable backup healer. Freya has a variety of team boosting buffs, but is also the most fragile of the warrior classes. This frailty encourages the player to take advantage of her hard-hitting jump attack, taking her out of the action for a time. Kina is perhaps the hardest character to wrap one's head around. On one hand, this is my favorite implementation of blue magic, even if it is occasionally a finicky pain of damage-based precision. It's best to think of it like Pokemon, where you must whittle the opponent down to an eighth of their health to catch, or in this instance eat, and therefore learn any ability they know. It allows for more control and agency in learning the individual spells, even if 1/8 is a surprisingly tricky amount of health to try and measure. On the other hand, almost none of these spells are straight up offensive attacks. They're either tied to Kina's own health value, are based on the enemy's own level, only have a percentage chance of working, or are more of a support ability. In other words, you need to understand Final Fantasy IX's interest in steering players away from focusing on raw power if you're going to have a chance of comprehending Kina's value. Now, recall my Final Fantasy VI video when I discussed the Cultist Tower, and how first-time players would no doubt find it frustrating meeting surprise after surprise. Even though this was my third time playing Final Fantasy IX, each playthrough was far enough apart that I did not have the greatest memory of its mechanics, foes, or dungeons. As such, all my footage is filled with suboptimal party builds struggling against the game's powerful beasts and monsters. On one hand, I wanted to blame this on the game side quests being tedious, clock padding activities holding some of the game's most powerful gear hostage, each piece of equipment possessing advanced skills for their respective character. Final Fantasy VI had laid just about every optional boss or ultimate weapon on the main path, making it easy for any player to obtain all the necessary tools to create overpowered spellslingers, no grind required. The problem with this complaint is that it ignores how many of Freya's and Kina's abilities I ignored or failed to take advantage of in my playthrough. While I could argue that the game doesn't give the player much time to get used to each character, the same argument could be leveled at Final Fantasy VI. My conclusion there was how rewarding the mechanics could be to those replaying the game, and if I'm honest, the same is true for Final Fantasy IX. As such, I don't have any footage of actual intelligent play towards the game's conclusion. I kind of beat the game based on luck. While there are some optional weapons and armor that would have imbued my party with helpful abilities, it wouldn't have prevented these bosses from being the challenge they were given my approach to them. Final Fantasy IX wants you to consider each character as an individual, to understand their strengths and their weaknesses. A process that begins with the game's story. In the recently released Inside Final Fantasy IX promotional documentary, former members of the development team revealed that Jim Henson's The Dark Crystal was a major inspiration for Final Fantasy IX. While you can certainly see this influence in the look of the world and its animal characters, not to mention a perfect explanation for Kina, who in hindsight looks and acts like a Muppet, it far more explains the very colorful main cast. I'm not just talking the playable characters either. the boisterous Baku and the Tantalus bandit crew that he leads, the wicked Queen Bran and her wiggly jiggly jelly belly, the insectoid Oglops and the Regent cursed into the form of one. It's a world filled with a fantastic, awe-inspiring imagination that would look perfect rendered in the Jim Henson puppetry style. From the game's opening act, you can see this mischievous, comedic influence inspiring the creators to begin not with a self-serious portent of doom or epic dystopias, but instead the promise of storybook adventure. I was unable to appreciate the comedic antics of self-serious Steiner at the age of 15 because I was a teenager and confused epic scale and serious scowls with mature storytelling. As an adult, however, it's clear to me that this opening is what hooks a lot of people into this setting. The whimsical excitement of adventure, and the thrill that similarly ensnares Princess Garnet into Zydane's promise of seeing a wondrous world. It's fitting, then, that Garnet is far more of a primary protagonist for half of the game than Zydane himself is. The monkey-tailed thief acts more as an enabler than anything else, encouraging and assisting Garnet and young Vivi in their central goals, all of which revolve around the already publicly discussed theme of life and living. Garnet and Steiner suffer the similar conflict of being defined by position. Being a princess means pretending to be someone you're not for the sake of the masses, and the very title of knight defines one's purpose as a servant to a kingdom. Garnet is first drawn to adventure by her concern for Alexandria, only to then be drawn to Zydane because he promises a freedom she has thus far not known. Steiner, on the other hand, follows the idea of his duty without any sense of proper self-interest, motivation, or examination. By thinking of nothing but his role as servant to the queen, he assumes Bran does no wrong because her job is not supposed to be that of a warmonger. Steiner defines people not by their human characteristics, but instead by their jobs or labels. This is despite the observable evidence to the contrary. The Plutonites under his command are lazy, cowardly, and incompetent. None of them act at all like their title would suggest they should. He fails to acknowledge the good hearts of Zydane or the other members of Tantalus, seeing nothing but a stereotype of wicked thieves and scheming bandits. It is only after Steiner must face and accept his queen's murderous, warmongering nature that he begins to ask himself what his title really means to him, which very slowly causes him to stop seeing everyone around him as a label. Instead, he learns to see them for the person they truly are. Comparatively, you can view Garnet's arc as the consequences of freedom and the acceptance of loss and regret. While at first she eschews her title and position in order to do what she believes is right, she grows to question her every decision after suffering the loss of civilians and her mother. It is only after she accepts her past decisions and loss that she regains her confidence, allowing her to progress forward with newly gained wisdom. By leaving her canary's cage, she was able to learn more about herself and the world, as well as provide some good, even though she couldn't always see how. On the opposite end of that spectrum is Kina, a culinary muppet perfectly happy to continue hunting frogs in the same old comfy marsh every day. It is only at the behest of Master Ku that Kina explores the world to try other kinds of food. It's a bit silly, but Kina's lesson is that you'll miss out on a lot in life if you continue to do the same thing day in and day out. It's an encouragement to step outside of your boundaries and try new things. Eiko is similarly positioned, having made a promise to her deceased grandfather not to leave Madain Sari until she came of age. By breaking this promise and following her destined-to-be-broken heart, she managed to find a new family. Perhaps most frequently referenced, however, is Vivi. It's no surprise that Vivi is a favorite character of so many. When we first meet him, he's the perfect sort of down-on-his-luck innocent, bright-eyed and finding wonder in even the smallest things. His childlike nature continues throughout the game, from his fascination in seeing chocobos, to his oblivious ignorance of the romantic chemistry between Zydane and Garnet. It is through Vivi that we get our most thorough examination of the game's theme of life and living. From finding out he's an artificial creation, to discovering others like him are used as tools of war, to learning of his limited lifespan, Vivi goes through the entire existential journey of one's own mortality in a short span of time. In order to best capture why he is so beloved, however, I think there is one particular moment we should examine. After witnessing the birth of a chocobo in the Black Mage village, most of his brethren following the villain Kuja in hopes of finding immortality, Vivi confesses that he felt confusion when he first learned of the mage's mortality. His adopted grandfather, one of Kina's kind, had told Vivi not to be sad when he had passed. This caused Vivi to be conflicted, wanting to mourn but trying not to be sad as his grandfather had told him. I think this manner of struggling not just with the reality of death, but also how he comes to term with loss, is part of what humanizes the character. It's not just that he was struggling to follow his grandfather's advice, he was struggling to understand what death meant as a whole, which is, of course, at the core of Final Fantasy IX's heart. How does one live despite the knowledge of death and mortality looming over all our heads? How does one live despite the very pain of living? Well, it turns out the game has some answers in mind. It's very simple to just say the theme of Final Fantasy IX is life and living, but it has a very specific philosophy of what a life well lived looks like. I touched on many of the personal, individual lessons that different characters learn, such as Garnet accepting the consequences of past mistakes and learning from them, Kina stepping outside of their comfort zone, and Steiner learning that occupations and labels do not define him or anyone else. None of these revelations would have occurred, however, were it not for the connections the characters made with one another. Garnet would never have had those adventures, made those mistakes, or learned to live with them were it not for Zidane helping her every step of the way. General Beatrix, a supporting character, and best girl, is at first seeking an opponent worthy and strong enough to fight her. But instead, she finds in Steiner a strong enough companion worthy of fighting alongside of her. Freya acts as a curious reflection to Steiner. Whereas Steiner was defined by his duty, Freya had fled her position and her people in order to seek out Sir Fratley, her missing paramour. Facing the fall of her kingdom Bermesia and witnessing the destruction of its sister community of Clara, confronted with the possibility of her people's genocide, Freya pushed her personal quest to the side in order to serve her people. Her motivations in following Zidane were informed by her desire to end the risk to her kingdom. Rather than prioritizing her connection with one man, she prioritized her connection with the whole of her race so that they could work together to build a future. She wasn't defined by her duty, but she fell into it due to the risk to her people. Amaranth thought only in terms of strength, combat, and killing until running into Zidane. While he's kinda not as well developed as the other characters, his challenge to Zidane at Ipsen Castle acts as both foreshadowing to the game's conclusion, as well as the game's philosophy on life. Amaranth insists that he can reach their destination alone before Zidane can with a group, and thus prove that working with others only drags one down. While he certainly beats the others to their destination, he runs into trouble and fails to leave the castle uninjured. Zidane goes back to find him, refusing to leave him behind since he, too, is a part of the group. To help hammer home the manner in which Final Fantasy IX presents these ideas, I'd like to focus in on the first time our heroes see Garnet as queen. Bran has fallen and the war is over, but no one is happy. Not only are the loose ends still frayed, but none of the characters have completed their emotional arcs. It's a great calm before the storm, as the game effectively returns you right back to the story's start. You're back in Vivi's shoes, but the whimsy and mirth are gone. Instead, there's a grey cloud cast over everyone. It is this sour atmosphere our heroes are wading through when they finally see Garnet as queen, dressed to the nines and reverting back to noble speech and mannerisms. She is physically elevated in this scene, visually indicating the biggest obstacle between her and her friends: status. A label. She is now perceived to be above them, unreachable and unattainable, and to Zidane that gap may as well be a canyon. The only character willing to bypass the facade is Eiko, whose summoner heritage bonds her to Garnet. While the rest of the cast are blinded by social expectations and how society has defined their positions, Eiko has no care for any of it. Garnet and Eiko confirm their sisterly bond, one that will soon serve an important role in the events to come. Of course, this breaking of boundaries had already begun. Garnet confessed to Beatrix moments ago that she was not, in fact, of noble birth, but to Beatrix it did not matter. The idea of being bound or defined by status or position was already beginning to break. Before I can further discuss how these elements are all brought together, I must discuss something I'm a little less than fond of. Before I explain why Zidane bugs me, I first need to contrast him with Edgar from Final Fantasy VI. Created by later Xenogears co-creator Soraya Saga, Edgar is a wannabe playboy doing his best impersonation of Bishonen anime cliché. His constant failure to woo the women around him would actually fit right in with the Jim Henson-inspired humor and whimsy of Final Fantasy IX. However, Edgar is also characterized by his kingship, his relationship with his brother Sabin, and to a lesser extent his interest in machines. He's also in his 20s. Credit to 9's writers, Zidane is certainly driven by the hormonal lust of a 16-year-old boy. Unfortunately, even when I was around that same age playing this game for the first time, I related far more to Steiner's stick-up-his-butt lawful good attitude. Rather than seeing the witty and cheerful protagonist shining brightly against the dark and gloomy attitudes of Cloud and Squall, I saw an obnoxious horn dog desperate to slip inside her queen's private chambers, as well as every other woman across the continent. I cannot lie that one of my favorite moments of the game is when Garnet drops a succinctly savage diss right after he critiques Kina's one-track mind. However, as insufferable as I found Zidane in the game's first half, I understand the arc the developers are going for. When you first arrive in Lindblom, Zidane hits on a tavern waitress, promising to show her a whole new world on his magic airship ride. When he's later hoping to cheer Garnet up, he forgets that this exchange was with the waitress, his attempt to be a slick player calling back to a prior come-on instead turning against him. He's still driven by lust at this point, as opposed to when Garnet is queen and he can't get her out of his head. Zidane is learning what it feels like to be in love with someone, to truly understand what it means to be with someone emotionally throughout the course of the game. Unfortunately, it feels like they're betraying this effort as soon as he heads to Trino, announcing to Amarant that he's anywhere there are beautiful women. This is followed by his hoping the Tetramaster card game champion is a cutie after discovering the champion is a woman. If Freya had maybe asked Zidane why he's trying so hard to put up a front, or he dropped a line about needing to move on from princesses and queens, I get that he's simply trying to get over his heartbreak the only way he knows how. Instead, it just seems like he's only bothered by Garnet when no other women are present to distract him. I don't want to make it sound like Zidane's obsession with women is a problem as a characteristic. My issue is primarily with how obnoxious it is presented and how it promptly feels forgotten once Alexandria is destroyed. He and Garnet effectively confirmed their feelings for each other, but not long ago he was in Trino talking up some big game. Sure, the sequence of events is moping for Garnet, then talking some game, and then affirming his affections. Taken as presented, though, that middle portion of game talking feels contradictory to the prior and latter scenes rather than an attempt to move on. But all that griping aside, it would be dishonest of me to suggest that Zidane is little more than a skirt chaser. As I said previously, Zidane acts as an enabler to the dreams and desires the other characters harbor. He may be trying to get handsy with Garnet, and handsy he gets, but he also sincerely wants to help her, be it by keeping her safe or trying to save her mother Queen Bran. While we aren't quite familiar with how Zidane and Freya met, we see just how willing he is to help his friends as he insists on accompanying her to the Under Siege Bermesia. As you progress through the game, it becomes pretty clear that, on the whole, Zidane simply likes people and he is always willing to help them out. He is at his best when he's basically just being a bro with Vivi. He never regards the kid as anything but a person even after discovering his kind are all manufactured. Zidane is always providing Vivi with advice and an ear to listen, but also emphasizes that what matters most is Vivi's own thoughts and desires. Which is precisely why Zidane's lowest moment it is the lowest moment. By this late stage of the game, you've discovered that Zidane was actually a creation of Garland's, what's referred to as a genome, in order to bring about the destruction of all life on Gaia. While I appreciate the acceptance Zidane has of this revelation rather than the typical mopey denial, he still forsakes all the philosophy and advice he's lectured into the other characters. He suddenly decides that, as an enemy of Gaia, he has to settle matters on his own rather than with his friends. After he fails and his friends come to help him, he rejects them, even going so far as to call them all babysitting bastards. Man, how can you be proud of this? I don't care that Phantom Headcanon no doubt has 1,000,001 explanations for how the shock of his origin sent him down a mental spiral. This is Zidane, the cheerful monkey boy of sunshine that makes Cloud and Squall look like a pair of My Chemical Romance loving smegheads. Really, let's compare this to the Zidane that regaled Garnet with a story about how he left Baku and the rest of Tantalus in order to find his home. Upon returning, he exclaims that Baku had beaten him to a pulp for daring to consider anywhere but Tantalus his home and family. Zidane was telling her this story because Vivi was going through the same thing. So why would Zidane suddenly forget all that? Why would he dismiss all of the advice he'd given Vivi on just this matter? Why would being a created genome suddenly cause him to believe he's an enemy of Gaia, when he's already accepted that no one defines who he is but himself? But this is just one part of why the final stretch of Final Fantasy IX just does not work for me. Okay, it might be easier to start with the fact that I don't mind Necron. One of the most common complaints about Final Fantasy IX's endgame is that Necron seemingly comes out of nowhere. I once felt that sentiment, but the point of Necron isn't to be a sort of mastermind. He is the embodiment of all that our heroes are fighting against. Much like Kefka had one final rant about the pointlessness of it all, Necron goes a step further and embraces non-existence. In other words, Kuja's fear of death driving a murderous intent is now manifested as a final boss. I don't mind this. I can work with this. Necron is a perfect, simple antithesis even if the dialogue is nonsense. The antithesis to life and therefore existence isn't death. It's to not have existed at all. No family, no memory to pass on, no friendship, nothing. By focusing purely on the pain of existence, such an offer of non-existence could certainly seem like a gift. In fact, it would have been nice if Necron could have gotten a bit more time to develop these ideas than just one last monologue. Instead, we have an entire backstory of a dying planet desperate to save itself crammed into a few hours of game time. While Final Fantasy IX was clearly working towards the reveal of Terra, all of our time dedicated on the planet itself is spent in exposition. Whereas we were able to feel the game's themes through characters like Garnet and Vivi, drowning in all the feels as it were, the player is left to drown in nothing but exposition here. Intellectually, I understand that Terra takes the fear of death and pain from a personal level to a worldwide level. It's an established degree of escalation we've witnessed since the beginning of the game. The Black Mages are a creation of Kuja and treated as little more than expendable tools by their creator, who himself is just such an expendable artificial creation. Bran selfishly sacrifices others for her own benefit, a dark desire lit within her by Kuja, who cares not for the lives of others, all in service of the Terrans, who endeavor to annihilate all life on Gaia so that they might continue living. Different scales of being driven by the self and disregarding the value of others. I get what Final Fantasy IX is trying to do and say. The problem is it breaks through the game's established storybook tone and atmosphere like the Kool-Aid man crashing an insufficiently hydrated party. If this game, as stated by the creators, is supposed to be the culmination of the entire Final Fantasy franchise up to this point, then Terra represents all of the weird, out-of-nowhere, convoluted plot choices of the prior entries. Time paradoxes, whale-shaped spaceships, the final boss being a tree, Cloud hijacking someone else's past. This is all of those decisions condensed into a single chunk of game, and it does a disservice to everything else this game manages to accomplish. I think this is one of the reasons Final Fantasy VI is remembered so fondly by a huge chunk of players. Its narrative is actually fairly straightforward, and the only thing confusing about it is the original English translation. Final Fantasy IX instead dove headfirst into the nonsense at the last minute. That's a shame because its greatest strength up to that point was the simplicity of its concept. An evil queen and her well-meaning daughter, the honorable to a fault guardian knight, the awestruck child prodigy seeing the world for the first time, and the carefree rogue that would guide them all. As the years have progressed, I've warmed up to a lot of aspects of this game. In fact, I've warmed up to just about everything. The mechanics, the characters, the narrative, even the final boss. Once Garland shows up in the skies of Alexandria, however, everything just starts heading downhill. This is where it is always headed downhill. I still enjoy much of the time with our main cast, but as the focus shifts to Kuja and Garland, it just loses that same charm it opens up with. Once that happens, it doesn't matter what the story is trying to do thematically. It actively sabotages its greatest strength of tone in favor of a convoluted mess that only drives me to hate these two villains all the more. This is one area Squaresoft should have left the typical absurdity of the franchise to the cutting room floor. I might dislike Garland and Kuja as villains, but I definitely understand the purpose they serve towards the greater whole. Garland is a slave to his duty and purpose, devoid of any personal desires or drive. The genomes were created to be nothing more than vessels for another's soul. The Black Mages were created as tools of war. Yet you could see a similar struggle in a character as human as Steiner, who failed to think beyond his duty. He was as much a slave as Garland until he took his own moral stand. Kuja abandoned his duty in order to pursue his own desires, but he continued to look down upon those around him. Bran cast aside her responsibilities as queen, and therefore abandoned the safekeeping of her kingdom and her people. Freya at first abandoned her own duty, but later came back when she realized what was at risk with her people. Garnet's own struggle was in trying to maintain her responsibility to her people and her kingdom without being caged by her position. Kuja and Bran rely purely on raw strength and military might to get what they want. They believe by wielding the biggest stick, or the most potent trance as it were, they can achieve their goals. Amarant once believed strength was all that mattered as well, but Zidane shows him that true strength is found in one's comrades. We can see this philosophy imbued in the game's combat design, our heroes frequently standing against powerful but solitary foes, the need to strategize rather than rely on raw strength, even the separate characters having a variety of abilities that go beyond just their class. Because just as our heroes learn not to be restricted by their titles and roles in life, they are not limited by their given character class. Freya and Amarant are both warriors, but each of them possess healing and support magic. They have use beyond basic attacks and damage dealing in combat. Both Garnet and Eiko are capable of offensive summoning magic, not just supportive and healing spells. Zidane may be able to steal items, but he's also a pretty powerful warrior himself. Kina defies definition. It is perhaps Steiner and Vivi that benefit from these themes the most. Early on in the game, Steiner is capable of little more than dealing basic damage. Vivi has no abilities beyond his black magic. Working together, Steiner is able to unleash a devastating blow powered by Vivi's magic. Together, they're able to do more than if they simply acted alone. By channeling the game's primary narrative themes into the combat, Squaresoft managed to fix a lot of the problems the franchise had been developing since Final Fantasy VI. Whereas that game was the first to start homogenizing your party members by granting them all magic, Final Fantasy IX maintained each character's unique identity while allowing freedom and customization of abilities. Rather than feeling restricted by each character's predefined class, each class is made multidimensional. The separate monsters and their encounters were then made more difficult to tackle in a simple, straightforward fashion, but easily overcome by thinking of alternate strategies in the cast's full array of abilities. In this way, Final Fantasy IX managed to achieve synthesis of gameplay and plot. I noted earlier that I don't actually mind Necron, and that's largely due to the purpose he serves in the game's conclusion. Where Terra and Garland feel like they're just hammering home an already obvious concept and message into the player's head, Necron actually feels like the culmination of the game's remaining ideas. To reiterate, Final Fantasy IX isn't simply about life and living. It's specifically professing a philosophy of a life well lived. What such a life looks like despite the great pains and loss suffered, the mistakes made and regrets felt. Garnet perhaps encapsulates this best, as she suffers the greatest consequences and loss in the whole game. Not only did she lose her parents and people as a child, but she lost her adoptive mother and her entire kingdom as an adult. She suffered so much, and yet she still found motivation to keep on living. Necron suggests that non-existence is preferable to a life of pain, but as the party marches through the collective memory of Gaia, heading towards the crystal at its core, they are given a far more grand vision of life. A shared genetic memory is how it is described, but the real message is clear. Pass your memory on to the next. We are not isolated, solitary beings. We all live together, we love together, and we hurt together. We are capable of harming one another, but we are also just as capable of helping one another. If we value each person, help them where they are weak, rely on them when they're strong, and support one another, then we can enrich one another's lives. Our physical bodies may die, but those left behind whose souls we've touched will carry our memory forward. Even if we as individuals will be forgotten generations later, the people we were can still live on in those who follow. Which is why Zidane went back for Amarant rather than leaving him behind, a move that would foreshadow his final decision. Though he and Kuja were made as enemies of Gaia, Kuja was still, to Zidane, his brother. And so, Zidane chose to go back and save the man that personified Amarant's philosophy of strength. Because no matter what he had done, Kuja's life and the memory he could serve still mattered. Yes, this idea of memory is presented at the game's end, but it is also what the game's philosophy had been building up to. It's the natural endpoint, the conclusion. We may be incapable of cheating death, and we cannot outrun pain, but what we do in life can live on in those that follow. That is what Final Fantasy IX is about, and that is why, I believe, it shall continue to be remembered itself as a classic. At the game's start, the crew of Tantalus are performing a play called I Want to Be Your Canary. The notion of the caged canary is a common one, and it is easy to see how this can relate to Princess Garnet. Kuja himself even refers to her as such a captive bird. The play tells of a young woman hoping to flee her kingdom so that she could be with the man she truly loves. The parallels between Garnet and Zidane are obvious, but in many ways every character starts out as a canary trapped in a cage. By the game's conclusion, we see how each character has escaped their cage and found a better life. Eiko is free of her village, free of isolation, and is now the adopted daughter of Regent Sid and his wife Hildegard. Kina is using their developed culinary experience to make the greatest banquet possible for Alexandria Castle. Vivi figured out how to continue living in memory, creating a whole slew of children, just as the words and wisdom of his grandfather continued to live on in himself. Amaran is no longer defined by his tenets of strength, willing to bond with others as comrades and companions. Most importantly, however, is Garnet herself. Constantly pressured by her status as princess and queen, she finally learns to set it all aside upon seeing Zidane alive. She drops the crystal necklace, both sign of her heritage and her royalty, and leaves it behind so that she can instead leap into Zidane's arms. She frees herself from her own cage, just as the princess of her favorite play has chosen to flee their cage for the sake of love. When I was 15, I was not capable of appreciating what this game's narrative was doing. I didn't get these characters, I wasn't able to see the deeper themes running through them, I was too preoccupied with Necron coming seemingly out of nowhere and the disaster I always perceived Terra to be. As an adult though, this ending this is why people love Final Fantasy IX. I can sit here and try to conclude how the game compares with its franchise brethren, but that fails to capture what makes Final Fantasy IX special. For all of its flaws, this game finds a way to just grip your heart and hold on tight. I wanted to conclude with, well, the game's conclusion, because it illustrates what so many games are missing. I don't think I played a game with even half the storybook whimsy aside from the Fable franchise, and those games just lack the heart present here. The developers put pieces of their own hearts into the game's narrative, each trying to convey the joys, pains, and frustrations of living in every character. So when you reach this conclusion and you see Garnet crying in Zidane's arms, you feel that happiness. Final Fantasy IX is not my favorite of the franchise. I don't even know if it's a favorite. I do know, however, that it's something special to me, and I intend to keep coming back to it in the years to come. As for the future, no more role-playing games, at least for now. I have some ideas to try and update more often, so I'll be working on some smaller, more linear games for the time being. I might even have some other surprises. Until then, please remember to like and share the video. Share it, get it out there, let other Final Fantasy fans know this video exists, subscribe, bell thing, all that stuff. And hopefully I'll see you in less than 3 or 4 months next time.